So how many of you are high school teachers?
Used to be.
Used to be, okay. And what about university professors? Okay, so I've done both. And I resonated with everything that you said. So thank you for that. And you set up what I'm going to say beautifully. So I decided to present on the literature of the Noosphere for secondary education. I am a university professor right now, but I share Human Energy's concern for the techno-social dilemma and its effect on youth and young adults. And during our Science of the Noosphere course, which I was so happy and fortunate to take, we started talking about how to teach the Noosphere almost as if it was an idea from somewhere else that we were going to impose on the curriculum or a problem to be solved. And so I'm going to take a bit of a different position and say it's already in the curriculum. And so my task right now is to identify where it shows up in the curriculum, where it shows up in literature, and how we can use that as an entry point to open up that space. So I'll be sharing with you some of my favorite literature, or just excerpts from them. And what I see, in addition to everything that John has named, because I definitely see that, I see that one of the most challenging aspects, perhaps, of teaching the Noosphere is that move from I to we, because that's not how we're socialized in Western culture. And so you heard Terry Deacon talk about METs, major evolutionary transitions, and we've talked about how the Noosphere is the next evolutionary transition. And so this is a convergence, but it's not a convergence of cells. It's not a biological convergence. It's a convergence that happens on the level of mind and on the level of heart and on the level of spirit, because Teilhard talked about all of those, and they were all integral to each other. So I'm going to share a few excerpts so that of some literature that might assist youth in reimagining themselves as part of nature, each other, and a larger sentient whole. So let's start with some definitions. I'll be talking about intersubjectivity, and these definitions here are from the Oxford Reference. The first one is the process and product of sharing experiences, knowledge, understandings, and expectations with others. The second one, which I like even better, is the mutual construction of relationships through shared subjectivity. So I'll be drawing on that one. I think it goes deeper. Let's also look at phenomenologist Edmund Husserl, and he said that that intersubjectivity was the interchange of thoughts and feelings, both conscious and unconscious, between two persons or subjects as facilitated by empathy. So this definition opens up a space for the work of Carl Jung and other social and cognitive scientists. So I'll be drawing mostly on Teilhard's chapter 10 from The Future of Mankind. This is a chapter that we studied together in our course. So Teilhard wrote that on the one hand, we have a single brain formed of nervous nuclei, and on the other, a brain of brains. So this is where we're going. He says, where in the case of the individual brain, thought emerges from a system of non-thinking nervous fibers. In the case of the collective brain, each separate unit is in itself an autonomous center of reflection. So that's the beauty of it, but it's also the challenge, right? How might we engender the notion of a brain of brains to our students? Because they're all thinking, but somehow they have to come together. Teilhard said that everything proceeds from the individual and depends on the individual, but it is on a higher level than the individual that everything achieves its fulfillment. This is a shift of thinking from what our youth are being taught in schools, isn't it? Everything is purposefully stirring, as in a living being. And that idea of living being points to Teilhard's notion of personalization that Ilia Delio talked about. So as matter complexifies, it also personalizes. So how might we teach this? Teilhard's noosphere has mind, heart, and spirit. He writes that the noosphere can function only by releasing more and more spiritual energy with an ever higher potential. It will be in a state of active sympathy, for if the power of attraction between simple atoms is so great, what may happen if similar bonds occur between humans? He says that in the future, through logical and biological deepening of the movement, drawing it together, it will find its heart, without which the ultimate wholeness of its powers of unification can never be fully achieved. As the noosphere complexifies, the curve of consciousness will break through the material framework of time and space to escape somewhere toward an ultra center of unification. Achieved with sympathy, union does not restrict, but exalts the possibilities of our being. What if we taught this in schools? Only by reaching to the heart of the noosphere will we find the fullness of our humanity. Teilhard's noosphere is animated by the energy of divine love and points to Omega. And we just heard Ilia speak so beautifully on Omega, so I won't go over that. But I do want to address the idea that sometimes it's hard to talk about Christ or Omega or God due to the tensions between world religions, between the sacred and secular, and even the separation of church and state here in the US, which I think is a very good law. We find ourselves grappling for a language that captures the noosphere without evangelizing, colonizing, or disregarding the individual. How do we do that? So if the language of Christ or Omega is divisive, what common language might we use to cultivate an understanding of the noosphere? I suggest that a language of nature, shared experiences, I see John shaking his head, shared experiences, empathy, and compassion enables us to move beyond differences and imagine the noosphere together. So here are a few examples of what this might look like. How many of you know this book, this Seed Folks? Okay. In Seed Folks, written by Paul Fleishman for young adults, the author looks at a community garden in a poor section of Cleveland, Ohio, as a public space of community. And here you can see the awards and accolades it's received. Newbery-winning author Paul Fleishman uses 13 speakers to bring to life a community garden's founding and first year. Seed Folks has been used to teach tolerance. It's read in ESL classes, promoted by urban gardeners, and performed in schools and stages from South Africa to Broadway. So here's the official book description. A Vietnamese girl plants 6 lima beans in a Cleveland vacant lot. Looking down on the immigrant-filled neighborhood, a Romanian woman watches suspiciously. A school janitor gets involved, then a Guatemalan family, then muscle-bound Curtis trying to win back Letitia, pregnant Maricela, Amir from India. A sense of community sprouts and spreads. Kim, a young Vietnamese girl whose father died before she was born, starts the garden by planting some seeds so that her father, who was a gardener, would recognize her as his daughter. So here you have this sense of identity, right? Young people are hungry for a sense of identity. So this is what gets her started. Then Anna, the Romanian woman and unofficial neighborhood snoop, becomes suspicious of Kim's comings and goings. So she digs in the small patch and she finds sprouted bean seeds instead of guns or drugs. So Anna starts to get buy-in. So next we're introduced to Wendell. Anna persuades Wendell, a janitor from Kentucky, to help her save the withering bean plants that have apparently been planted too early in the season. Wendell's growing involvement in the garden brings him a sense of agency and empowerment. He's changed by this. Wendell says, "There's plenty about my life I can't change. Can't bring the dead back to life on earth. Can't make the world loving and kind. Can't change myself into a millionaire. But a patch of ground in this trashy lot, I can change that. Can change it big." Nora, a British nurse, is pushing Mr. Miles, a despondent stroke victim, in his wheelchair when he signals her to stop. They discover the garden. She pushes him onward, only to be stopped again. She says, "I turned the wheelchair and headed back. I could see his nostrils taking in the smell of the soil. We reached the lot. His arm commanded me to enter. Over the narrow, bumpy path we went, his nose and eyes working. Some remembered scent was pulling him. He was a salmon traveling upstream through his past." We might connect this with the idea, with Teilhard's notion at least, of omega, pulling us through creation, through evolution, toward itself. The story of Maricela, an angry Mexican teenager pregnant with an unwanted child, is one of the most poignant stories. Forced to work in the garden as part of a program for pregnant teens, she has a lot of resistance, but then finally she has a breakthrough moment when she realizes that her body is part of nature. She says, "I was related to bears, to dinosaurs, to plants, to things that were 1,000,000 years old." She realizes that it's not a disgrace, but an honor to be part of nature. And for just that minute, I stopped wishing my baby would die. A community grows around the garden, with pantomime used to overcome the language barriers. And over time, some of the prejudices and some of the problems of the larger culture creep into the dynamics of the garden, but they solve them at the neighborhood level. And so the garden becomes a great equalizer, providing common ground for a shared consciousness and heart. Anna, at the end, says, "We were all subject to the same weather and pests." I think it's raining outside. Great background. The same neighborhood and the same parental emotions toward our plants. We, like our seeds, were not planted in the garden. And now we have Barbara Kingsolver's book, The Bean Trees. How many of you have read this? Yeah, great. So in this novel, she uses a metaphor of wisteria vines to represent a network of supportive relationships. The novel is about a young Kentucky native, Taylor Green, who only wants to get away from her roots and avoid getting pregnant. She succeeds, but suddenly a 3-year-old Native American girl is thrust upon her at a gas station, and she becomes the surrogate mother. She names the little girl Turtle because Turtle doesn't really talk. She's very withdrawn because she suffers from failure to thrive. But Taylor is fascinated with the bean trees. She calls them bean trees, the wisteria vines. And so Taylor, her surrogate mother, reads everything she can about the bean trees to learn more. And this is what Taylor says. But this is the most interesting part. Wisteria vines, like other legumes, often thrive in poor soil, the book said. Their secret is something called rhizobia. These are microscopic bugs that live underground in little roots, in the little knots in the roots, and they suck nitrogen gas right out of the soil and turn it into fertilizer for the plants. The rhizobia are not actually part of the plant. They are separate creatures, but they always live with the legumes. a kind of underground railroad moving secretly up and down the roots. It's like this, I told Turtle. There's a whole invisible system for helping out the plant that you'd never guess was there. I loved this idea. It's just the same as with people. The way Edna has Virgie, and Virgie has Edna, and Sandy has Kid Central Station, and everybody has Maddie, and on and on. The wisteria vines on their own would just barely get by, is how I explained it to Turtle. But put them together with rhizobia, and they make miracles. And so the image of interrelated networks may inform our notion of the noosphere. And those of you who took the course heard a lot about that. What other books teach about invisible networks? Anybody want to throw something out? No ideas? That's okay. So let's move on to another author. In The Island by Gary Paulson, a prolific author of books for youth, the character of Will Newton, a teenage artist and writer, goes off to live alone on an island in the center of a lake in northern Wisconsin, only to find himself part of, rather than the world he's trying to escape. Drawing studies of the heron in his sketchbook, he reflects, I could see the heron in all the things the heron was, without seeing the heron at all, and it changed me, made me look at all things that way, made me see in a new way, and finally it made me look at myself in that new way. Although he looks at the heron while drawing him, his deeper knowing of it comes from imagining what it must feel like to be inside the heron's body. Joining the bird in empathic fusion enables him to feel it within himself and then to know it as his own self or subjectivity. And I think your students on retreat often feel that way. How many of you have read Siddhartha? Okay, great. Yeah, I think almost all of us have read that. So in Siddhartha by Herman Hesse, the river becomes the center of unification. After years of uneventful physical and spiritual wanderings that do not lead to the happiness that he seeks, Siddhartha comes to live with Vasudeva, the ferryman, and finds himself in the river. The river gazed at him with 1,000 eyes, with green, with white, with crystalline, with sky blue eyes. And once again, when the river swelled in the rainy season and was roaring mightily, Siddhartha said, "Is it not true, O friend, that the river has many voices? Very many voices. Does it not have the voice of a king and of a warrior and of a bull and of a night bird and of a woman giving birth and of a sighing man and 1,000 other voices? It is so, nodded Vasudeva. The voices of all creatures are in its voice." And I'd like you to read this slide with me. He could no longer distinguish the many voices. Everything was one. Everything was entwined and entwisted, was interwoven 1,000-fold, and all of it together, all voices, all goals, all yearnings, all sufferings, all pleasures, all good and evil, the world was everything together. We are the noosphere, aren't we? He did not bind his soul to any one voice and did not enter them with his ego, but listened to all of them, heard the wholeness, the oneness. Then the great song of the 1,000 voices consisted of a single word, which was Om, perfection. We might also turn to the works of the nature writers. This is my favorite genre, for further insight into the noosphere. Theologian Douglas Burton Christie explains that nature writing inhabits and searches out those charged borderlands, those places of encounter where longing gives way to relationship, communion, intimacy. This simple, radical relationality lies at the heart of nature writing. Here in this liminal space, it becomes possible to imagine the apparently impermeable boundaries that separate one place from another, spirit from matter, ourselves from other living species, ourselves from God, as permeable. It becomes possible to imagine ourselves as no longer standing aloof and distant from the world, but as caught up into, transformed by the intimate presence of the living world within us and around us. Here's an example. In nature writer Loren Eiseley's story of The Dance of the Frogs, has anyone read The Dance of the Frogs? Okay. A young scientist comes across an esteemed elder scientist, Albert Dreyer, in a tavern. The usually private and sedate Dreyer tells him of his experience of being caught up in the spring rite of the frogs returning to the water for mating and egg laying. Dreyer explains, and I quote, "There is a time to skip. On country roads in the spring, you will skip because something within you knows the time, frog time. Then you will skip. The water was pulling them, not water as we know it, but the mother, the ancient life force, the thing that made us in the days of creation and that lurks around us still unnoticed in our sterile cities. It was pulling Dreyer too. You dare not look, because beside the shadows there now comes to your ears the loose-limbed slap of giant batrachian feet, not loud at all, but there, definitely there, behind you at your shoulder, plunging with the utter madness of spring, with rhythm entering your bones until you too are hurtling upward in some gigantic ecstasy that is not given to mere flesh and blood to long endure. I was part of it, part of some mad dance of the elementals behind the show of things. Even as I leaped, I was changing. It was this, I think, that stirred the last remnants of human fear and caution I still possessed. My will was in abeyance. I could not stop. Furthermore, certain sensations, hypnotic or otherwise, suggested to me that my own physical shape was modifying or about to change. I was leaping with growing ease. It was just then that the wharf lights began to show. We were approaching the end of the road, and as I have said, the road ended in the river. It was this, I suppose, that startled me back into some semblance of human terror. Man is not a land animal. He does not willingly plunge off wharfs at midnight in the monstrous company of amphibious shadows. Nevertheless, their power held me. We pounded madly toward the wharf, and under the light that hung above it and the beam that made a cross. Part of me struggled to stop, and part of me hurtled on, but in that final frenzy of terror, before the water below engulfed me, I shrieked, "Help! In the name of God, help me! In the name of Jesus, stop!" Dreyer is forever changed by his participation in the dance. Reflecting on his research with frogs, he admits, "I have never been able to handle them for research since. My work is in the past." Early on in the story, we learn that part of Dreyer's mystique as a retired scientist involves a black glove that he wears on one hand. The mystery of the glove is now revealed. He paused and drank, and then, seeing perhaps some lingering doubt and confusion in my eyes, held up his black gloved hand and deliberately pinched off the glove. A man should not do that, to another man without warning, but I suppose he felt I demanded some proof. I turned my eyes away. One does not like a webbed batrachian hand on a human being. In conclusion, the characters in these narratives are boundary crossers who, through love, empathy, and compassion, move beyond their individual sense of self toward a participatory consciousness in which their being is not diminished but exalted. Each is pulled toward greater wholeness by a powerful unseen force. Teilhard has written of this mystery, but he's not the only one. As we can see, this idea has arisen independently in the work of others. Finch and Elder, who are editors of the Norton Book of Nature Writing, the Norton Anthology. And they say that all literature, by illuminating the full nature of human existence, asks a single question: how shall we live? I think the literature here gives us some examples. And this is just the alignment. Here we are. So I suggest that the literature featured in this presentation promises to help heal the alienation that results from the techno-social dilemma and discover the joy and promise of a shared consciousness toward a viable planetary future. To participate with hidden forces of evolution, drawing us ever more deeply into the noosphere. For as Ilia Delio points out in her new book, The Not Yet God, that which is hidden is more powerful than that which is seen. So I've only looked at a few aspects of the noosphere here and its presence in literature, and there's a lot more work to be done. I invite you to join me in finding these openings in the curriculum for teaching the noosphere. Thank you.